Well, let's get to our first topic of discussion today. Now, liquidity crisis and poor infrastructure in Nigeria's electricity supply industry has remained the biggest known hindrance to 24-hour electricity supply across the country. Given that the primary source of electricity generation in Nigeria comes from gas, which accounts for 86% of capacity, with the remainder generated from hydropower sources, with electricity infrastructure being hit by a multitude of challenges that have led to constant collapse of the national grid. Now, the country's power sector will continue to face this monetary setback until the government finally enables the mobilization of resources to tackle the challenges facing the sector and allow capital punishment for those involved in the vandalism of power infrastructure across the value chain. To discuss this, now I'm being joined via Zoom by Mr. George Utomi, who's the chairman of West Power and Gas. He is also the principal partner, our law firm at George Utomi and Partners, a distinguished transaction lawyer for over 41 years' experience in legal profession. He has also garnered a wealth of experience in diverse areas of commercial law, cutting across various commercial transactions in the fields of energy and natural resource law, aviation law, building and construction law, banking and finance, arbitration. I can go on, but he has narrowed his focus to energy law. Thank you so much, Mr. George Utomi. It's good to see you. Mr. Tommy, can you hear me? Thank you for your time.
Now I can hear you, Tolu. Thank you so much.
All right, then let's get talking. A lot of issues in recent times about our disco, and most of this is around liquidity and not being able to meet financial obligations. What is the true state of the distribution arm of Nigeria's electricity industry?
The true state is, as you correctly identified, is the liquidity crisis. There's a liquidity crisis that affecting the entire value chain. As you know, it's the collections that the disco make that should ordinarily go towards servicing the entire value chain. But like you correctly identified, over 80% of our power comes from thermal plants, and the feedstock is gas. Gas represents close to 70% of the tariff component. So if the collections from the disco end is unable to meet with that cost, and that cost will entirely depend on whether or not the tariff is cost reflective, you have the shortfall that the sector is experiencing. And it is this shortfall that has been the subject of subsidies in the past. And if you ask me, I think these subsidies have been inefficiently deployed. But that's where we are today. Even though we now have a tariff increase, it's still not enough for various reasons. One, the manner in which the tariff increase has been done have created a degree of tariff shock amongst our consumers, because from tariffs of a particular range, if you recall, upon the onset of COVID, the tariffs were doubled. And that has created tariff shock amongst consumers. So we're facing a high level of meter bypass, energy theft. And that's also a major problem in the industry. Now, to address the question of how these will be redressed, as you're aware, there's recent legislation passed by the National Assembly, I think it was the Senate, on the new, what will be the new Electricity Act. And then there's also the constitutional amendment that's proposed that should give states the ability to participate in the value chain. Currently, they can't do that. How we might report legislations is a question of how we plot the future. But to address the latest of the bills, which is the one just passed recently, that bill is seeking, as it were, to expand on the current privatization. It actually recognizes it, which is very good, and has gone on to make for provisions that should make for an expansion of the market. For example, one of the things it introduces is a fourth segment to the market. Hitherto, we had three segments: generation, transmission, distribution. Now they've added a fourth segment called the electric supply, the electric supplier, which means that in the future, distribution companies will hand over power to the electric supplier, who then deals with consumers. Hopefully, I don't know how that's going to work in practice. I always have worry when you create too many segments. Already we're dealing with bureaucratic issues with three segments to now add a fourth segment. I don't know how that will work, but this segmentation is also reflected in the new laws passed by Lagos State, Edo State, Ondo State, in their attempt to participate in the industry. But having said all that I have said, the key thing is that the money we need to revamp the electricity sector is not in this country. It's in the hundreds and billions of dollars. And what we must do is to create the enabling environment to attract that sort of money from the foreign investors. And what we do by way of the enabling legislation and regulatory framework will determine whether that confidence will be there. And that is why it is so important that in X-ray, these new provisions, that they do the job they're supposed to do. As you're aware, for example, now, 5 discos are under the hammer, if you can put it that way. Now, if that process is not carefully managed, it will be a discouragement to foreign investors. Because whether or not you like it, the reason why we've had a lot of problems has likely been to the fact of the gas constraints, which has been admitted even at government level. Gas prices are not benchmarked to international gas prices. Gas producers give Genco's gas on best endeavor basis, so they cannot be contractually compelled to give gas. So whenever they feel like, they give the gas. And that's why you have this frequent grid collapse. If you move away from that, transmission is still wholly government. And it comes with all the vagaries of doing business with government. The transmission for all the investments in it still cannot will, as we can see clearly, more than 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts. So for the distribution companies, they can only distribute what they get. So it's not going to be helpful if we continue with a regime in which you have these bottlenecks all over the place. The federal government has come up with initiatives, one of which is the Cement Initiative, designed at generating more power and also strengthening transmission and distribution. We'll see how far that goes. But I think the principle here is that we must recognize that electricity holds the key to the diversification of this economy. And it is important that all stakeholders must come together, learn the lessons from the existing privatization. Nobody should be badgered, nobody should be bludgeoned. What we must do is sit down and discuss what we've learned, the successes, the failures, the pressure points, the wins, and discuss all those things so that we can begin to streamline this thing. Once we show confidence ourselves in our ability to find solutions, then you can begin to attract foreign investors. Again, I repeat, the money to take us out of this quagmire is not here. We must create that enabling environment to attract much needed funds into the sector.
Well, intensive one. I must say that was really, really detailed now, looking at what's been happening with the sector since privatization. And that is where I want to take us back to and looking at this new law, this reform, this new Electricity Act. Is there not going to be any change anywhere? You will understand the legal implications of all of this. Do you think that would affect anything? Then on the other side, on the investors' side, are they doing enough also to invest? I think there should also be, it's a win-win thing, though I know government will do more, but are they also doing their part to invest in all of the infrastructure on ground?
To take the first question, which is what impact will the new site should not be done in a manner to obstruct the business. So I would urge caution. If oversight means these agencies have to go to the National Assembly to have their budgets approved or to have anything done, it's not going to work, I can tell you for free from the outset. The electricity market doesn't work that way. One of the reasons we have problems with TCN today is that being in the middle of two privatized entities, i.e. the GENCOs and the DISCOs, the process by which TCN works is still subject to the vagaries of government. So they are not keeping step with the private sector approach of both the GENCOs and the DISCOs. So it's a weak link. And I don't want this legislation to repeat that mistake. The part of expanding the business to attract newcomers is good. But again, as I told you earlier, if you begin to put a fourth segment, I worry about the bureaucracy that will be involved in dealing with 4 members of a value chain. There's a new dispute resolution mechanism. It tries to, today, if you have electricity issues, you go to the state high court. It is trying to give jurisdiction to both federal high court and state high court. But again, I'll tell you for free, under the constitution that gives jurisdictions to the federal high court, electricity is not contained. So a law which makes a provision that conflicts with the constitution will shrink to the extent of that inconsistency. So again, from the outset, that's not going to work. It also gives powers to the regulator to disaggregate the DISCOs to give effect to this fourth segment. How that process is going to be managed is yet to be tested. It also gives the regulator the power to take over DISCOs that are not performing. But it also adds a proviso that if this non-performance is as a result of government failing to fulfill its own side of the obligations, as we have seen, for example, the MD is not paying their debts, not allowing for cost-reflective tariffs, not keeping in step with gas pricing and all that, then the DISCOs cannot be taken back. So there are a lot of provisions that will be tested, but my own attitude always is that we must learn from the banking reform, the telecom reform that have been successful. There were hitches, but most of these hitches were resolved through dialogue. Because with the best of intention, any legislation can get life from when the market participants agree. That is what external investors are looking at. If they see a disgruntled local investor, for example, some of these things that are being done now, like this, in my opinion, unwise takeover of 5 DISCOs, it could result in litigation. And nobody's going to come here when there are litigations on ground. Nobody's going to do that. Investor confidence comes when there's a smooth atmosphere, because investment in the power sector is long-term, because it requires patient capital, because it's going to take a lot to modernize all the segments of the industry, from generation to transmission to distribution. So you look for long-term form. And the way you attract long-term form is just to leave a friendly atmosphere. We've seen that in telecoms. We've seen it in banking. Now, on the second question of whether or not the investors are making investments, the answer is yes, but there's one major constraint. When you have a tariff regime where the sale price of a product is regulated and it is below the market, you already have a gap. If, as I've always said, electricity market price is 15 naira per kilowatt hour, regulator says sell it for 30. There's already a gap of 20. If adequate arrangements are not made to cover that gap, no investor should be expected to cover that gap. And that's one of the problems we have. The expectation that people will invest in a market where regulation and policies have not been in step with what was agreed is going to be a challenge. So investors are willing to invest. People who borrowed money, put hundreds of millions of dollars, they've shown faith that they can invest in this economy. But government must play its own part so that we can take this journey together. I'm not interested in any blame. I'm not interested in any passing the buck. We must all sit together. And we did that successfully in the last 12 to 24 months under the auspices of the central bank, when all the various market participants were talking together like people with a common desire to take this country out of this electricity quagmire. I do not see why competing economies like South Africa, Egypt can be ramping up generation in the region of 40 to 50 megawatts, and we're still grappling with 5,000 megawatts. That's a no-no. We must be we're too proud for that. So the answer is yes, investments are being made, but it's not showing up because it's going essentially to subsidize the sector, and that's not good enough.
Well, I would like us to wrap up on this note. Hopefully we can do this in 2 minutes. It's another two-in-one question. One is, we are aware that of maybe planned sales of some power plants, and the House of Rep is already looking into that. With what we've witnessed with our privatization process, is that the way to go? That's on one side. Then on the other side, do you think really this grid can satisfy us as Nigerians, our population? Do we not need to start looking away from the grid?
Yes. The first question to do with, no, let me take the issue of the grid, because I think that's even more important. The grid is centralized. I really think we should begin to look at more modern ways. We can segment the grid. We can disaggregate it and have states or whoever deal with it. We could also have mini grids. There are renewables coming. So we must get to the point where you can actually sectorize the power value chain and begin to give power to those who can pay. There's an attempt in the existing framework to allow for that. That's why you have eligible customer regime, which is actually giving a lot of voice under the new law. But it needs to be made a lot more robust. But I agree with you. The modern trend is to disaggregate so that you can segment sectors and begin to give people power. Because if you look at, for example, your overall cost profile for power, if you include your diesel, solar, inverter, and then your general cost for grid power, it's humongous. So if you can eliminate all this in one consolidated tariff based on efficiency, people will pay. I've always said that if Nigerians see power, they will pay, because in the long run, it's cheaper for you. We already have examples that exist. People in Magodo, many of them have not turned on their generator for like 3 years. There are some consumers in the Eco network too who have those special arrangements, and they're happy because on the long run, it's cheaper for them. It gives them peace of mind. They don't have to inhale generator fumes. They are more productive, you sleep better, and so many things like that. We now need to upscale that and make sure that it becomes available to everybody. There will always be a segment of the population that will struggle with high tariff. And those are the ones that can be easily isolated, and you can direct subsidies to cushion the effect until such a time as they become robust enough to pay. There is nowhere in the world where electricity, those who can afford electricity, do not subsidize for those who do not have. It's done everywhere, across professions, even in healthcare. Those who pay subsidize those who cannot pay, but it all needs to be carefully worked out. I am an incurable optimist. I believe these reforms will stay. Just to answer the first question, will it work? The principle of privatization is good. We've seen it work for banking, for telecoms, for aviation, and all that. So it's the way to go. Gone are those days where we all have to queue up for just one Nigeria Airways. But now you have choices to make. Telecoms, gone are your days where you have to go and sit at night to make international calls. Everybody does stuff on their phone for a variety of reasons. Banking, gone are your tally number days, where you go and state and line up and beg to withdraw your own money from the bank. And these things are now taken for granted. If it's happened and successfully done by Nigerians for Nigeria, it can happen in the power sector.
It's a good way to leave it. I must thank you so much, Chairman, West Power and Gas, Mr. George Tomi. Do enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for making sense of this topic today.
Thank you.